and Sarah Wilson appeared to be the perfect couple until a chilling discovery revealed a dark, twisted secret hidden behind their seemingly normal life. When Sarah went missing, no one suspected her husband. But as Detective Rachel Hayes uncovered a web of lies, manipulation, and obsession, she was horrified to learn that Mark's carefully constructed facade concealed a crime more monstrous than anyone could have imagined. What started as a missing persons case quickly turned into a haunting tale of control, deception, and murder. It started with a phone call, one that would change everything for the small town of Maplewood. Sarah Wilson, a 32-year-old mother of two, had gone missing. Her husband, Mark Wilson, was the one who called 911, claiming that he had come home from work to find the house empty, with no sign of Sarah or their children. Neighbors described Sarah as a loving, dedicated mother who never left her kids behind. The local community was shocked, as there had been no warning signs that something was wrong. Mark, however, seemed oddly calm for someone whose wife had just disappeared. When the police arrived, they found Sarah's children, Emily and Ethan, alone in the house. Both kids were visibly shaken but had no idea where their mother was. Emily, the older of the two at 9 years old, had told police that she last saw her mom early in the morning before going to school. Ethan, her 5-year-old brother, couldn't offer much detail. His words jumbled and confused as he clung to his sister. The house was neat, nothing appeared out of place, and there were no signs of a struggle. Sarah's purse, car keys, and phone were all still inside the home. It was as if she had simply vanished. Detective Rachel Hayes, a seasoned investigator with years of experience handling missing persons cases, was assigned to the case. At first, it seemed like a straightforward disappearance. Perhaps Sarah had left for some reason and would return soon. But as Hayes began questioning Mark, she started to notice something strange. He spoke about his wife's disappearance in a detached, almost clinical way. He didn't seem frantic or panicked, despite the nature of the situation. When asked about Sarah's possible whereabouts, Mark repeatedly said he didn't know, but there was something in his eyes that suggested otherwise. Hayes felt a chill run down her spine as she observed Mark's behavior. He was polite, but too composed for someone whose life had just been upended. Sarah's friends described her as a devoted mother who would never leave her children. No one could recall any signs of tension or problems in the marriage, and the community painted a picture of a happy, normal family. Mark's calm demeanor seemed to conflict with the alarm that was rippling through the town. As the investigation unfolded, the police discovered that Mark had been at work when Sarah disappeared, and there was no evidence to suggest that anyone had been in the house other than the family. The case started to take on a more eerie tone when a search of the house didn't reveal any clear clues. The children were interviewed, but neither of them had any concrete information that could help the investigation. Emily spoke about a strange man who had been walking near their house earlier that week, but it didn't seem to be connected to Sarah's disappearance. Despite the lack of physical evidence, Detective Hayes had a gut feeling that something was off. She had seen enough in her career to recognize when a case didn't add up. Mark's strange behavior was beginning to raise red flags. Yet, there was nothing that definitively pointed to him. At this stage, it was still a mystery, one that would take unexpected twists and turns in the days to come. The investigation was only beginning, but one thing was clear: nothing about this case would be as simple as it first appeared. As the investigation into Sarah Wilson's disappearance continued, Detective Rachel Hayes started to delve deeper into Mark Wilson's life. Initially, Mark seemed cooperative, answering questions and providing alibis for his whereabouts. However, something about his responses didn't sit right with Hayes. He seemed too composed, too unaffected by the gravity of the situation. While everyone in town was searching for answers, Mark appeared to be standing on the sidelines, almost as though he were an observer, rather than someone actively involved in his wife's disappearance. Hayes and her team began to scrutinize Mark's background more carefully. A review of his financial records revealed a series of unusual transactions over the past few months. There were several large cash withdrawals, which struck Hayes as odd for a family that seemed to live within their means. It wasn't the kind of spending one would expect from a man who worked as a middle manager at a local logistics company. The money was being withdrawn in small amounts, just under the reporting threshold, making it harder to track. The withdrawals had been taking place at different ATMs around town, often late at night when the streets were quiet. This was the first indication that Mark might be hiding something, though it wasn't enough to jump to conclusions just yet. Next, the police took a look at Mark's online activity. His social media accounts painted a picture of an ordinary man, nothing unusual, just routine posts about family gatherings and his work. But when they went through his email and search history, things took a darker turn. Mark had been browsing some very specific websites, forums dedicated to controlling and manipulating people, as well as others discussing unsettling topics about domination and power dynamics. He had also purchased items that seemed out of place, things like restraints, specialized cameras, and other equipment typically associated with surveillance or control. Hayes was horrified by the implications, but still lacked hard evidence connecting Mark to Sarah's disappearance. While all of this was disturbing, it was the discovery of a few strange, unmarked packages delivered to Mark's home that would raise even more alarms. The packages, which had been sent over the course of several months, contained unusual items, things like obscure books on psychological manipulation, items of clothing that looked like they belonged to someone else, and even an assortment of locks and chains. There was nothing to tie these items directly to Sarah, but their presence hinted at a sinister undertone that had been lurking beneath the surface of Mark's otherwise ordinary life. The most disturbing revelation came when Hayes and her team decided to examine the house more closely. Mark's insistence that everything was fine, that Sarah had simply vanished without a trace, seemed less plausible the more they dug. They began by re-examining the master bedroom, where they discovered something odd in the closet. Hidden behind a row of coats, they found a stack of old photographs, some yellowing with age, of various women. The images were unsettling. Some of the women appeared to be in distress. Others were in odd, unnatural poses. Some were even tied up or restrained in ways that made Hayes' skin crawl. At first, it wasn't clear who these women were, but there was a chilling realization Mark's life wasn't as normal as it had seemed. He had been hiding something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Despite the shocking nature of these findings, Hayes couldn't yet draw a direct line from the photographs to Sarah's disappearance. However, there was a growing sense that Mark was hiding more than he was willing to admit. As the investigation deepened, it became increasingly clear that Mark had been leading a secret life, one that no one in the town had ever suspected. His calm, collected exterior now seemed like a carefully constructed mask, hiding something far more sinister. The case, which had started as a simple missing person investigation, was beginning to unravel into something much darker, and Detective Hayes knew that she was only scratching the surface of a very disturbing secret. As the investigation into Mark Wilson deepened, the team uncovered a disturbing trail that pointed to far darker secrets than anyone had imagined. Detective Rachel Hayes was growing increasingly convinced that Mark wasn't just an innocent man who had lost his wife, but rather someone with a much more sinister agenda. It was becoming clear that the man who had been portrayed as a quiet, hard-working father was hiding something far worse than anyone could have guessed. The breakthrough came during a thorough search of the Wilson home. Mark had been cooperative, but his calmness only seemed more suspicious as time passed. The police had already found the stack of photographs hidden in the closet, showing women in various states of distress, some in poses that suggested they were bound or restrained. But there was something that had been overlooked, something that would change the entire course of the investigation. While going through the basement, Hayes noticed a section of the floor that seemed uneven. It was subtle at first, but something about it didn't sit right. The boards were old and worn, but they had clearly been disturbed recently. With the help of a few officers, Hayes pried up the floorboards and discovered a hidden compartment underneath. What they found inside made their blood run cold. The compartment was filled with old, musty boxes and crates. As they opened the first box, they found an assortment of photographs, but not like the ones they had seen in the closet. These pictures were different. They were all of Sarah, but they were not taken in any public or happy setting. Some images showed Sarah in compromising positions, clearly unaware she was being photographed. Others were taken in the home, and one in particular stood out. It was a picture of Sarah, bound to a chair, her eyes wide with terror. Her hands were tied behind her back, and her body language screamed panic. The discovery left the detectives horrified. It became immediately clear that Mark had been hiding a twisted obsession with his wife for years. The photographs were not simply the work of a voyeur. There was something much darker at play. Mark had been stalking Sarah, taking these disturbing pictures of her when she didn't know, secretly documenting his control over her. The more they looked, the clearer it became Sarah had been trapped in Mark's web for a long time. The basement was filled with even more unsettling items. There were journals, hundreds of them, each filled with pages and pages of disturbing entries. Mark had written about his thoughts on control, manipulation, and power dynamics, with an obsessive focus on Sarah. The journals described how he had been meticulously planning her disappearance for months, even years. He spoke of how he had slowly worn down her will, subtly manipulating her into believing that she couldn't escape. He had orchestrated their life together as though it were a game, and Sarah had unknowingly been a pawn. Mark's journal entries were chilling. He had intended to disappear with her, to make her vanish from everyone's life forever, but something had gone wrong. The details in the journals indicated that Mark had planned to make Sarah a permanent part of his secret life, keeping her isolated, under his control. Hayes now understood why Mark had seemed so detached throughout the investigation. He hadn't been concerned about his wife's disappearance, because he had already planned it. He wasn't searching for Sarah, he was hiding the truth. The police had unwittingly stumbled upon the key to unlocking the entire mystery of Sarah's disappearance. But the worst discovery was yet to come. As they continued searching the hidden compartment, they uncovered a large, sealed box. Inside was an assortment of items, locks, chains, and even a few high-tech cameras. These weren't things a typical family man would have. They were tools of control, designed for one purpose: to keep someone under constant surveillance. Mark's secret life had been about more than just photographs and manipulation. It had been about total domination, about breaking down Sarah's will and keeping her in a state of fear and submission. The deeper Hayes dug, the more she realized that Sarah's disappearance wasn't a random act. It was the final, horrific step in Mark's twisted plan. The evidence was undeniable now. Mark had been living a double life for years, hiding his darkest secrets in plain sight. He had trapped his wife in a world she could never escape from, and Sarah's disappearance was the result of his sickening obsession. Detective Hayes now knew that the case was far from over. Mark had planned this carefully, but he hadn't counted on the police unraveling his carefully constructed facade. The search for Sarah was far from over, but Hayes now knew that finding the truth would be more horrifying than anyone had imagined. As the case continued to unfold, Detective Rachel Hayes felt a sense of urgency growing inside her. With the chilling evidence they had already discovered, Mark's disturbing photographs, his secret journals, and the items hidden in the basement, it was becoming more apparent that Sarah Wilson's disappearance was not a random event, but the result of a twisted, calculated plan. Yet, despite all the evidence pointing toward Mark, there was still no body, no definitive proof of Sarah's fate, and this lingering uncertainty haunted Hayes and the rest of the investigation team. Mark Wilson had, by all appearances, vanished from the public eye. In the days following Sarah's disappearance, he had become increasingly elusive. The few interviews he granted were nonchalant, almost dismissive of the police's efforts to find his wife. He no longer seemed interested in assisting with the investigation, leaving his behavior even more suspicious. His every move, every word felt like an attempt to avoid revealing the truth. After the discovery of the hidden compartment in the basement, Hayes was convinced that Mark had orchestrated Sarah's disappearance with careful precision. He had been building his twisted world for years, and Sarah had been the central figure in it all. She began to theorize that Mark might have planned for Sarah to escape or even die, knowing that the longer she stayed trapped in his control, the less chance there was of her breaking free. But if Sarah had somehow fought back or tried to escape, Hayes believed Mark might have killed her in a desperate attempt to cover his tracks. The breakthrough came when forensic experts examined the photographs and journals more closely. A series of disturbing patterns began to emerge. The journals weren't just about Mark's obsession with Sarah, they also described his need for complete control, to break down his wife's resistance until she was utterly dependent on him. It was as if he had planned everything down to the smallest detail, and one key entry stood out. Mark had written about a final step, something he described as the ultimate escape. At first, Hayes had no idea what that meant, but it became chillingly clear as they started cross-referencing the entry with his recent activities. The ultimate escape referred not to a physical getaway, but to a permanent solution to Mark's problem with Sarah. He had planned for a scenario where she would never be able to tell her story or escape his grasp. In one of his more recent journal entries, he described how he had staged a location, a place where no one would find her. Hayes's heart sank as she realized what Mark had done. He had hidden Sarah's body, knowing that without the body the police wouldn't be able to charge him for murder. It was a brilliant, if horrifying, move. He had planned everything, even Sarah's silence. The detectives, led by Hayes, expanded their search efforts. They began combing through the remote areas around Maplewood, focusing on nearby forests, abandoned cabins, and isolated locations where Mark might have disposed of Sarah's body. The search was painstaking and, at times, seemed hopeless. But the team refused to give up, knowing they were on the edge of something far more sinister than they had ever imagined. Finally, after weeks of searching, they received a tip from an anonymous caller who claimed to have seen a man matching Mark's description heading into the woods late one night, carrying something heavy. The location was remote, deep within a thicket of trees, far from any main roads. The police rushed to the area, their hearts pounding with the hope that they had finally found the missing piece of the puzzle. As they dug into the earth beneath the spot described by the tipster, the officers uncovered a shallow grave. When they unearthed the body, there was no mistaking it. Sarah Wilson's remains were found, her body buried in a hastily dug hole. Her injuries were consistent with what the investigators had feared. She had been strangled, and the signs of struggle indicated that she had fought desperately before her life was taken. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation team. They had known it was coming, but nothing could prepare them for the devastating confirmation of Sarah's death. Mark Wilson had not just orchestrated his wife's disappearance, he had murdered her, ending the life of the woman he had manipulated and controlled for so long. The search for Sarah was finally over, but it was a grim victory. With the body recovered and the evidence of foul play clear, the police moved quickly to arrest Mark. They didn't have to look far. Mark was found in a remote cabin, living off the grid, having planned his escape meticulously. He hadn't just been evading the law, he had been living in a twisted fantasy, free from the consequences of his actions. When he was arrested, Mark showed no signs of remorse. He was, in his own mind, simply completing the story he had written for himself. The case of Sarah Wilson's disappearance was no longer a mystery, it was a chilling tale of manipulation, control, and murder. Mark Wilson's disgusting secret had finally been exposed, but the horror of his actions would haunt everyone who had been involved in the investigation. As the case reached its final stages, Detective Rachel Hayes found herself grappling with the full weight of the horror she had uncovered. Mark Wilson had orchestrated his wife's disappearance with a level of calculation that left her disturbed. Not only had he murdered Sarah, but he had also concealed his actions with a meticulous web of lies and manipulation that had fooled everyone around him. Mark's chilling detachment, his calm demeanor in the face of such a heinous crime, made everything even more difficult to comprehend. After Mark's arrest, the police wasted no time in bringing him to trial. The evidence against him was overwhelming: the hidden photographs, the disturbing journals, the forensic proof linking him to Sarah's murder. All of it painted a damning picture. But what unsettled everyone the most was the complete lack of remorse Mark showed. In interviews, he never once expressed sorrow or guilt for taking his wife's life. In fact, it became clear that he viewed the entire ordeal as part of a twisted game. To him, Sarah had been just another pawn in his carefully constructed world, and her death was the final piece of the puzzle he had been working on for years. The trial was an emotional roller coaster for everyone involved. Sarah's friends and family spoke about the woman they had lost: her kindness, her devotion to her children, and how she had always seemed to have everything under control. They described a woman who had been gentle and loving, a mother who did everything for her kids, but none of them could have known the darkness that had lurked behind the closed doors of the Wilson home. To them, Sarah's marriage had seemed like a typical suburban relationship, not a prison built on control and fear. They could hardly believe the man they had all thought of as a quiet, loving husband could be capable of such evil. As the prosecution presented its case, the full extent of Mark's manipulations was laid bare. The details of his secret life, his obsession with control, and the eerie journals he had written about his plans for Sarah made the courtroom tense with discomfort. But perhaps the most unsettling part of the trial came when the defense attempted to argue that Mark had been suffering from mental illness, claiming that his actions were the result of some deep-seated psychological condition. This attempt to reduce Mark's responsibility for his actions only further enraged Sarah's family and the community. They wanted justice, not excuses. It was clear to everyone in the room that Mark's crimes were not the result of a moment of madness, but a calculated, deliberate course of action that had been planned over the course of many years. The jury deliberated for several days, but it was a foregone conclusion. The evidence was undeniable. Mark Wilson was convicted of first-degree murder, and the verdict sent a collective shiver down the spine of everyone who had followed the case. Sarah's life had been tragically stolen from her, and there would be no second chances for Mark to fix what he had destroyed. In the aftermath of the trial, Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict brought a sense of finality to the case, but the emotional scars left on Sarah's children, Emily and Ethan, were far from healed. They had lost their mother in the most traumatic way imaginable, and their father, who they had trusted, was the man responsible for her death. Their lives would never be the same, and though they would eventually find healing, it would take years before the pain began to fade. Detective Hayes couldn't help but think about how Mark had managed to hide his true nature for so long. In a town like Maplewood, where everyone thought they knew their neighbors, no one had suspected the evil that had been right under their noses. It was a chilling reminder that even the most ordinary-looking families could harbor the darkest secrets. Hayes would never forget the case of Sarah Wilson, the woman whose life had been stolen by the very person who was supposed to protect her. And Mark Wilson, with his twisted need for control and power, would forever be a symbol of the terrifying evil that can lurk behind the most unsuspecting faces. The horror of Sarah's death would linger in Maplewood for years to come. The town had been shaken to its core, its innocence shattered by the brutal truth. And for Detective Hayes, the case would remain one of the darkest and most tragic of her career, a constant reminder of the evil that can sometimes hide in plain sight.